When they opened the body of Charles II in the year 1700, what they found made one doctor faint, and another refuse to go on. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His brain shriveled like a walnut. His organs, blackened, twisted, and quietly rotting, told a story centuries in the making. This was not just the death of a man. It was the collapse of a dynasty that once ruled the world, an empire so vast that the sun literally couldn't find a corner of earth to hide from it. Charles II of Spain, they called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was the last light of a collapsing star, a king born from too many royal marriages and not enough fresh blood. So how did Europe's most powerful family breed its own destruction? And why did Spain mistake a curse for a crown? If you believe history owes its ghosts a hearing, subscribe. It's the least you can do for the dead. And tell me, what time is it where you are? Midnight? Dawn? Either way, we're about to descend into the strangest nightmare a king ever lived. Long before Charles II ever drew his first fragile breath, his tragedy had already been written, meticulously, generation after generation, in royal ink and matching surnames. The House of Habsburg wasn't just one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. It was also, unintentionally, its most genetically enthusiastic experiment. You see, where other families worried about dowries, treaties, or suitable personalities, the Habsburgs worried about something else entirely, keeping the blood pure. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Pure blood, like a fine vintage you'd never dream of mixing. But in practice, it meant centuries of marrying cousins, nieces, uncles, and sometimes, rather alarmingly, both categories at once. The Habsburgs had turned their family tree into something that looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. A perfectly circular tangle with nowhere new for the roots to go. 100 years before Charles's birth, this was considered political genius. The logic was simple, at least to them. Why give your empire away to strangers when you can simply keep marrying each other and hand it to yourself? The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family ruled half of Europe between them. Their motto, unofficially, could have been, "Why diversify when you can double down?" Take Philip II of Spain, Charles's great-grandfather. The man married 4 times, which sounds adventurous until you look at who those wives were. One was his cousin, another was his niece. It's like a family reunion that got completely out of hand. But for Philip, this wasn't scandalous. It was strategy. His marriages were carefully designed to consolidate territory, preserve Catholic unity, and, conveniently, keep the crown bouncing safely between familiar hands. Of course, when your family gatherings start to look like international summits, it's easy to forget that genetics don't care about borders or politics. The Habsburgs treated their bloodline as sacred, untouchable, divine, something closer to gold than hemoglobin. Yet what they didn't realize was that every cousin they married was another coin flipped toward disaster. Every generation narrowed the gene pool until, by the time Charles arrived, there was hardly a pool left, just a puddle with royal expectations. Let's talk about the Habsburg coefficient, a term that would make any modern geneticist twitch. This little number measures just how inbred a person is. The likelihood that they'll inherit the same genes from both parents. Most of us hover comfortably around 0. Charles II's coefficient was around 0.25, which is the genetic equivalent of being born to your uncle and your aunt at the same time. His great-great-grandparents weren't just relatives, they were repeat characters. Entire branches of his family tree folded back on themselves like origami. But to the Habsburgs, this was the ultimate show of dynastic loyalty. They believed God himself had chosen their blood as the vessel of empire, and if divine favor required a little cousinly affection, well, so be it. Every baby born with that famous Habsburg chin, a proud, jutting jawline that looked capable of cracking walnuts, was seen as proof of heaven's approval. It didn't occur to them that the same jaw might eventually refuse to close. Philip II's son, Philip III, continued the tradition with all the enthusiasm of someone playing genetic Jenga. His reign marked the beginning of Spain's slow, elegant decline. Economic crises, colonial overreach, and endless wars fought for a family name rather than a national cause. Yet the royal nursery stayed busy marrying cousins off like diplomatic chess pieces. Each union promised stability. Each wedding carried the quiet ticking of biological collapse. You might imagine that someone, some thoughtful court physician perhaps, would have raised an eyebrow and said, "Majesty, perhaps a little fresh blood?" But no. The church, the court, and the crown all agreed that the family's purity was its strength. To question that was to question God himself. And questioning God was never a popular career choice. Meanwhile, across the continent, other royal families were experimenting with something radical: alliances through diversity. The Bourbons in France, for instance, were marrying into different dynasties, creating networks of influence that stretched far beyond their borders. But the Habsburgs looked on in horror. To them, this was dilution, scandalous mingling with people who were, frankly, not Habsburg enough. They believed that if kingship was a divine right, then divine blood must never be tainted. In reality, the blood wasn't divine. It was simply exhausted. And by the late 16th century, nature began to hint that it had had enough. Infant mortality in the Habsburg family skyrocketed. Many royal children were born sickly, sterile, or disfigured. Entire lines ended quietly in infancy, as though the genes themselves were giving up the fight. But instead of reading these tragedies as warnings, the dynasty treated them as tests of faith. "We are bewitched," they whispered. "The devil envies our greatness." By the time Charles's father, Philip IV, was born, the family had already perfected the art of ignoring reality. Philip himself married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, a move so spectacularly short-sighted that even his court's chroniclers winced. One Spanish diplomat famously wrote that His Majesty might have married half of Europe, and yet he chose the quarter that was already his. Mariana, for her part, came from a long line of similarly folded DNA. The pair produced a handful of children, most of whom died young. Only one boy lived, and barely. That boy would be Charles II. In the dim light of Madrid's royal palace, portraits of ancestors hung like silent judges. Each face bore that same unmistakable chin, the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same family resemblance that had become both a badge of honor and a curse. Imagine walking through those halls as a young heir, every painted gaze reminding you that you were not just born into greatness, but into expectation, into prophecy, into a lineage that could no longer sustain itself. When Charles was born in 1661, he wasn't the start of a story. He was the punchline to a very long and uncomfortable joke. Centuries of strategy had led to a single child who could barely stand, barely speak, and yet carried the weight of a world that once believed itself immortal. It's tempting now to shake our heads and call it arrogance, but there's something tragic about it too. The Habsburgs genuinely believed they were preserving God's chosen bloodline. They just never imagined that divinity, like everything else in nature, comes with a price for those who refuse to change. And so, As the 17th century dawned, Spain's royal cradle rocked under the strain of history's most exclusive gene pool. Behind the marble columns and velvet curtains, the nightmare was already growing, quietly, inevitably, cell by cell, each generation tighter until the womb would collapse in on itself. It was November 6, 1661, when the bells of Madrid tolled for joy. Inside the royal palace, Queen Mariana of Austria had just given birth to a son, fragile, silent, and far too still. Outside, crowds cheered, waving their hats and crossing themselves, certain that the birth of a male heir meant God had smiled once more upon Spain. Inside, however, the air was thick with incense, fear, and the faint realization that something wasn't quite right. The baby did not cry. In an age when that first wail was the sign of life itself, Charles came into the world in near silence, like a candle flame too weak to flicker. Midwives whispered. A priest mumbled a quick baptism before the infant could slip away. And in the background, courtiers held their breath, waiting for a sign, any sign, that Spain's future hadn't arrived stillborn. When the child finally stirred, a shuddering, half-breath motion, the court physician reportedly thanked the Virgin Mary aloud. But the moment passed uneasily. One observer wrote that the newborn was of frail constitution and his aspect most lamentable, which, translated out of 17th century politeness, meant he looked like he'd already fought for his life and might not bother to do it again. Still, this was a royal birth, and royalty didn't have the luxury of acknowledging weakness. So the palace did what palaces do best. It performed. Bells rang, cannons fired from the ramparts, decrees were written praising God for the vigorous health of His Majesty the infant. Vigorous health being, apparently, a relative concept. Mariana, still pale and trembling from the ordeal, cradled her son while priests swarmed the room like anxious midwives of faith. They sprinkled holy water, burned herbs, and prayed over him in Latin. Someone claimed to see the shadow of a dove cross the floor and declared it a sign of divine favor. Someone else muttered that the child had been born under an unlucky star. By the end of the night, both interpretations had made their way into official rumor. The first weeks were a blur of hope and panic. The baby, christened Carlos II, refused to suckle. Every feeding became a desperate negotiation between infant instinct and the limits of his malformed jaw. Nurses changed daily. None could get him to take milk without choking. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his neck too weak to hold his head upright. At times he would twitch and stiffen in his cradle, his small body convulsing as the nurse crossed herself and whispered prayers against possession. Medicine, in 17th century Spain, was a curious blend of scholarship, superstition, and sheer audacity. The court physicians approached the newborn like a theological puzzle, half patient, half prophecy. They prescribed purgatives to clear the humors, rubbed his gums with honey mixed with crushed pearls, and swaddled him so tightly that his limbs were nearly fused, believing it would strengthen his posture. When that failed, they turned to holy relics. Bits of saintly bone placed beneath his pillow, candles blessed by the archbishop, water from the Jordan mixed with a drop of his mother's tears. Nothing worked, but no one dared call it hopeless. You could doubt medicine in Spain. You could never doubt the will of God. By the time Charles reached his first birthday, he had survived more fevers than most soldiers did in a lifetime. Each time he pulled through, the court proclaimed it a miracle. His survival became a symbol of divine favor, a living rebuttal to the rumors that the royal bloodline was cursed. But miracles, as Mariana soon learned, are not the same as health. The queen adored her son with the kind of fierce, anxious devotion that only mothers of fragile children understand. She saw holiness in his frailty. Every tremor of his hand, every distant stare became evidence that he was touched by heaven rather than haunted by heredity. To her, he was not broken. He was chosen. And if God had chosen him, then Spain must simply believe. Outside the palace, the empire that once spanned 4 continents was beginning to show its cracks. Gold shipments from the Americas were dwindling, harvests were poor, and merchants grumbled that Spain's glory days had sailed off with the last galleon. Yet within the palace walls, all that mattered was this child, a tiny coughing symbol of continuity. There's a peculiar kind of optimism that grips powerful families when reality starts to fail them. It's the optimism of denial. Ministers who privately feared the worst began referring to the prince as our little phoenix, rising from every fever stronger than before. Pamphlets circulated proclaiming his recovery as proof that the Habsburg line was protected by angels. But behind closed doors, the doctors kept notes they dared not show the queen. They described spasms, an inability to focus his eyes, a worrying lethargy. One wrote in Latin that the prince's constitution is as the shadow of a candle in a draught. That same doctor later left court abruptly, sent on medical duty abroad, which was royal speak for being fired without anyone having to say why. When Charles turned 2, his father Philip IV hosted a grand celebration, less a birthday party than a declaration of survival. Tapestries were unfurled, choirs sang, and the frail toddler was carried into the hall to be displayed before the court. He blinked at the crowd, drooled slightly, and waved one limp hand before being whisked back to bed. The applause was thunderous. Spain, they said, had its king in waiting. From that moment, every faltering breath Charles took became a matter of state. His fevers were national emergencies, his recoveries, national holidays. The palace doctors grew bolder in their treatments, which included bloodletting, mercury tonics, and, on one particularly inspired occasion, applying the pulverized remains of a mummified saint to his gums. Mariana oversaw it all with maternal faith and a dash of political terror. Losing this child would mean losing the last thread holding the dynasty together. And so, Charles lived, if survival can be called living. His baby teeth came late. His bones grew slowly, as though reluctant to commit. At 3, he still couldn't walk unaided. Courtiers cooed over him, calling his silence a sign of contemplation, his blank stares the wisdom of a deep soul. The king himself avoided the nursery. Fathers were less sentimental about omens. When Philip died 2 years later, leaving a 5-year-old heir and a widowed queen, it was hard to say which was weaker, the boy, the monarchy, or the will to see the truth. The chroniclers of the time were careful, even reverent, when describing these early years. You won't find the word deformed in the official records. You'll find blessed. You won't find ill. You'll find tested. Spain had convinced itself that suffering was proof of sanctity. To admit otherwise would mean admitting that divine blood had failed, that heaven had lost interest. And so, as the child king lay in his cradle, his tiny body battling odds that medicine could barely name, the empire outside continued its decline. Armies lost ground, ships sank, taxes rose. Yet at court, all eyes were fixed on a single fragile flame, praying it would not go out. It's easy, centuries later, to call them blind. But in their faith, however misplaced, was a strange kind of courage. They refused to give up on a child who represented the sum of everything they believed about order, lineage, and divine destiny. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, not out of mockery, but out of awe. He was the living embodiment of both their sins and their hopes, proof that God could still choose to bless them, even if his methods seemed cruel. And so the baby who should have died in his first night lived on, pale, trembling, and perpetually miraculous. The bells that rang for his birth would ring again and again for his recoveries, until the line between blessing and warning blurred entirely. And if you're still listening, maybe part of you refuses to look away from what happens when power forgets its own fragility. So go on. Subscribe. It's the least you can do for a world that once believed endurance was the same thing as destiny. In the summer of 1665, the royal palace in Madrid fell quiet. King Philip the Thorder, the weary, silver-bearded monarch who had spent his life trying to keep the Spanish Empire from falling apart, finally ran out of breath. The court chroniclers wrote that he died in the odor of sanctity, which was a polite 17th century way of saying he smelled awful, but everyone pretended not to notice. His 4-year-old son, Charles, was asleep when the messengers came. When he woke, the world had already decided he was king. Imagine that. One moment you're a fragile child who still struggles to walk straight. The next you're sovereign of an empire stretching from Peru to the Philippines. The ink dried faster than anyone's conscience. Spain had not crowned a man that day. It had crowned a symbol, an heir in miniature, trembling under robes he could barely carry. The crown, of course, was far too big. It slipped forward on his head during the coronation rehearsal, and a bishop had to steady it discreetly with one hand. No one said a word. In Spain, silence was the preferred form of crisis management. Queen Mariana, now widowed, stepped naturally into power as regent. Her official title might as well have been the one who must keep the child alive. She ruled by two forces she understood intimately: prayer and fear. On her bedside table stood a crucifix and a stack of unsigned decrees. The crucifix she consulted daily. The decrees, well, those depended on whichever advisor had managed to win her ear before breakfast. The ministers around her quickly learned how to weaponize piety. Every political debate became a theological one. God favors this treaty, someone would say, and that was that. To disagree was to risk heresy. Spain's empire, once built on steel and silver, was now held together by superstition and paperwork. Outside the palace, the world was changing faster than Madrid could pretend to notice. The 30 Years' War had drained Spain of money and men. Famine crept across the countryside. The silver fleets from the New World arrived lighter each year, their holds stuffed not with treasure but with excuses. The once invincible armada had become more rumor than reality, and the Dutch, those stubborn Calvinist merchants, were quietly stealing Spain's oceans one trade route at a time. But inside the palace walls, time stood still, thick, perfumed, and drowsy. The air smelled of incense and damp velvet. Courtiers shuffled through endless ceremonies, bowing to a throne that contained a child who barely understood what a throne was. Charles's every movement became ritualized. When he sneezed, servants blessed him. When he blinked too slowly, they whispered prayers for strength. When he smiled, rarely, it was treated as a national event. He was surrounded by people who adored him publicly and pitied him privately. The boy's tutors taught him Latin phrases he could not pronounce. military exercises he could not perform, and etiquette he would never grow into. At lessons, he was praised for simply staying awake. When he forgot words or drooled mid-sentence, everyone pretended not to notice. Spain had entered a new political philosophy. If no one mentions the problem, perhaps it doesn't exist. The real business of empire continued in secret. Ministers met behind closed doors, drafting policies that would later be presented to the young king as simple yes or no questions. Charles, eager to please, would nod, or occasionally, if the question was phrased just right, grunt his approval. Congratulations. Spain had invented the world's first automated approval system. One might expect the court to show compassion for the boy, but compassion and politics rarely share the same room. Every nobleman saw him as an opportunity, a ventriloquist's dummy in divine clothing. The Queen's Austrian advisors pushed for alliances with Vienna. The Spanish grandees favored autonomy. Each faction claimed to act in Charles's name, and each blamed the others when things went wrong. The empire became a stage where everyone spoke for the king except the king himself. And yet, through all this theater, Charles was still a child, a lonely, bewildered child living in a world where affection was ceremonial. He had toys, of course, but most were replicas of adult things: miniature swords, tiny cannons, an ivory throne built to scale. The concept of play seemed foreign to him. One visiting French diplomat wrote that the boy regards all laughter as suspicious. It's hard to blame him. When your every giggle can be interpreted as divine revelation or political weakness, you learn to keep a straight face. He spent his days wandering the palace corridors, trailed by nurses and priests, sometimes stopping to stare at portraits of his ancestors. The faces that gazed back, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, were all variations of his own: long chins, tired eyes, the same narrow mouths. It must have been like growing up inside a hall of mirrors, every reflection reminding him that his life wasn't entirely his own. Meanwhile, outside those heavy palace gates, Spain's empire continued to wobble. In the colonies, viceroys acted like kings in their own right. In the north, France, under the Sun King, Louis XIV, began to outshine the faded grandeur of Madrid. The poets still called Spain the land where the sun never sets, but increasingly, it seemed to be setting everywhere at once. Queen Mariana tried to combat decline the only way she knew how: through religion. She held public prayers, processions, and fasts for her son's health. The capital became a theater of piety. But the people were tired, hungry, and less interested in saving the soul of their young monarch than in finding bread that wasn't made of chestnut flour. Still, they prayed because the alternative was despair, and Spain had never been good at admitting defeat. In those early years, Charles's world was small but heavy. Every object around him was symbolic: the crown above his crib, the scepter carved into his baby carriage, the rosary hung beside his bed. Even his bedtime stories were political: tales of saintly kings, divine victories, and the unbroken glory of the Habsburg name. He listened quietly, half understanding, perhaps wondering why the heroes in the stories never seemed to smile either. One chronicler described him at age 5, sitting through an official council meeting with grave silence beyond his years. They said it admiringly, as if solemnity were wisdom, but it was really confusion. The boy didn't know why men twice his height kept kneeling before him, or why they looked relieved when he said nothing at all. And yet, amid all this stillness, there was a strange kind of peace. In those rare moments when the courtiers weren't hovering, Charles would watch the light drift across the marble floors of the Escorial palace, tracing its slow journey like a secret map. Perhaps, for those few unguarded minutes, he was simply a boy again, before the lessons, before the crown, before the empire began demanding that he be more than he could ever be. But peace never lasted long in Spain. News would arrive of another lost battle, another empty treasury, another famine, and the queen would redouble her prayers. Every misfortune was blamed on the enemies of the faith, which conveniently meant anyone who disagreed with her. The ministers took turns whispering advice like penance, and the empire kept limping forward under the steady weight of denial. By the time Charles reached his 8th birthday, he was king in name and prisoner in practice. He couldn't play in the palace gardens without half the nobility following him like nervous chaperones. He couldn't touch his food before a priest blessed it. Every gesture, every glance, every word he managed to form was interpreted, recorded, and explained by others. A human life had become a state document. The strange part is that no one saw it as cruelty. To them, this was care. Spain believed it was protecting him from the world when, in truth, it was isolating him from it entirely. A living relic couldn't be allowed to mix with ordinary air. The courtiers often said, "Our little king has the patience of a saint." But saints historically don't get much of a childhood. By the end of the decade, the regency had settled into its routine of prayer, paralysis, and polite decay. Spain's fortunes continued to slide, but in Madrid, ceremony remained unbroken. And at the heart of it all sat the boy who would never truly rule the empire that ruled him. The child who was worshipped instead of understood. The king who was bowed to by everyone, but never played with anyone. The boy learned early that crowns can be cages. There are moments in history when an empire doesn't fall with a bang. It simply exhales and forgets to inhale again. By the mid-1600s, Spain was that empire. Magnificent in memory, exhausted in reality, and somehow convinced that denial counted as divine endurance. The country that had once discovered new worlds now couldn't keep its own streets lit. Its golden age had become more of a tarnished evening, one where poets still wrote of glory, but everyone else just wished the bread hadn't turned gray overnight. To the casual observer, Spain still looked vast. Its maps were magnificent, endless lines of red ink tracing continents like veins in a sleeping giant. But on closer inspection, that giant wasn't sleeping, it was suffocating. The air itself seemed thinner in those years. The little ice age had swept through Europe like a divine prank, chilling crops, freezing rivers, and turning Spain's fertile plains into frost-bitten fields. Harvests failed in Castile year after year. Villages emptied quietly, their people gone in search of warmth, food, or just the memory of both. Priests called it punishment for sin. Farmers called it Tuesday. Meanwhile, Spain's cities were crumbling from within. Madrid, the empire's proud capital, smelled of incense and sewage in equal measure. The once bustling markets were lined with beggars, former soldiers, dismissed servants, widows of wars, no one could name anymore. Even the aristocracy had begun to pawn their silverware, which was ironic, considering how much silver Spain still claimed to own. You see, the empire was drowning in wealth it couldn't actually use. The galleons from the New World kept arriving, heavy with silver, gold, and ambition. But every coin that reached Spanish shores only deepened the country's poverty. It was the world's first recorded case of being too rich to survive. Inflation ran wild, prices soared. Bread cost more than wine, and yet no one seemed particularly cheerful about it. Economists, though they didn't call themselves that yet, warned that an empire cannot breathe on silver alone. Spain ignored them. After all, God had chosen her, and chosen nations don't balance their budgets. The problem was that everyone else had started doing math. The Dutch, those bothersome Protestants with their ships and ledgers, had broken away and were busily inventing capitalism. The English had discovered the art of naval smugness. The French had Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, whose court glittered with power while Spain's flickered like a candle in a draught. Spain had once been the model all Europe feared. Now it was the warning everyone whispered about. Its enemies didn't need to attack. It was already losing wars to its own inertia. And at the center of all this decay sat a child king who could barely draw breath without help. Charles II's fragile health became the empire's favorite metaphor. Courtiers compared his fainting spells to Spain's momentary setbacks, his recoveries to divine mercy. Each time he caught a fever, the stock value of Spanish optimism plummeted. The royal doctors, bless their medieval hearts, treated both patient and nation with the same approach, a mix of prayer, leeches, and denial. When Charles wheezed, they prescribed air from the mountains. When Spain wheezed, they prescribed more colonies. Neither cure worked particularly well. There's a record of one nobleman who, upon seeing the young king's pale, breathless face, remarked, "He is the living Spain." He meant it as a compliment. In hindsight, it reads more like prophecy. Because the truth was, the Spanish Empire had built itself on a kind of divine asthma, each expansion a gasp, each victory a held breath that never quite exhaled. For a while, faith had been enough to keep the chest rising. But now, faith itself was winded. The irony, of course, was that the very thing that had made Spain great was the thing that was killing it, its appetite for glory. The silver from the Americas had once funded cathedrals, armies, and paintings that shimmered like sunlit gold. But it also built dependency. The empire forgot how to earn wealth. It only knew how to extract it. And extraction, by nature, is not a renewable act. By the late 1600s, Spain's colonies were restless, its fleets unreliable, and its debts astronomical. The crown borrowed money faster than it could count it, mortgaging tomorrow to survive today. The bankers of Genoa and Amsterdam quietly became the empire's true rulers. They didn't wear crowns, but they did something far more powerful. They charged interest. And yet, within the palace, the illusion held. Ministers reported victories that never happened. Reports of new ships being built were repeated so often that courtiers began to believe they existed. The entire administration was an elaborate act of collective imagination, 1 part faith, 2 parts fraud. Even nature seemed to join in the farce. During one particularly cruel winter, a river froze solid just outside Madrid. Rather than see it as a warning, the court declared it a blessing and held an ice festival on its surface. Skaters in silk glided where fish used to swim. It was beautiful, delusional, and perfectly Spanish. Through it all, the people kept praying, because prayer, at least, was free. The church bells never stopped ringing. Monks preached that Spain's suffering was the price of divine love, and that the king's frailty was the kingdom's penance. Somewhere between faith and fatigue, the line blurred entirely. And there sat Charles II, tiny, pale, his breath shallow, his body trembling under the weight of robes embroidered with worlds he'd never see. When he coughed, the court flinched. When he recovered, they celebrated with fireworks. Spain's identity had become inseparable from his pulse. It's said that once, during a ceremony, Charles tried to lift a ceremonial sword and nearly dropped it. The hall gasped as though the empire itself had slipped. The sword was quietly shortened for future appearances. That, in a way, was Spain's strategy too. Keep trimming the blade and call it victory. Beyond the palace walls, the world moved on. The Dutch East India Company ruled the seas. England's merchants were discovering that trade could conquer more effectively than any army. France was perfecting the art of diplomacy wrapped in perfume. But Spain still stood before the mirror, adjusting its crown and telling itself it looked fine. Even art, that proud Spanish export, began to fade. Velázquez was long gone. His successors painted faces that looked more like ghosts than nobles. The colors dulled, the light dimmed, and every portrait of Charles seemed to carry the same expression, a faint, confused sorrow, as if he too wondered what everyone was waiting for. The irony is, Spain didn't collapse because it was defeated. It collapsed because it couldn't admit it was tired. Pride had become oxygen, and there was no fresh air left. By 1670, the empire's chest was rising slower. Wars bled the treasury dry. The once mighty fleets were sold for scrap. Even the clergy, those tireless defenders of divine monarchy, began to whisper prayers that sounded suspiciously like apologies. But denial is a stubborn thing. Each morning, the bells still rang. Each evening, the candles still burned before portraits of the kings who had once commanded continents. And in the center of it all, Charles kept breathing, barely. His shallow gasps echoed through the marble halls, a fragile rhythm that Spain mistook for stability. The empire had learned to synchronize its heartbeat to his, each pause a crisis, each exhale a reprieve. From afar, it still looked magnificent. Up close, it was gasping. Every breath he struggled for, Spain gasped with him. If you asked a 17th century court physician why the King of Spain was sick, you'd get a very confident answer, just not a correct one. An imbalance of humors, they'd say, while pouring something unholy into a golden cup. Too much black bile, not enough faith. Another might add, as though piety could cure chromosomes. To be fair, medicine back then was half theology, half improvisational theater, and Charles II, poor soul, gave them plenty of material. By his teens, the young king had become a walking syllabus of every ailment known to man, and a few that science would only later discover. His case wasn't just medical, it was cosmic. The court saw his frailty as proof of enchantment, a divine riddle for which the answer must surely involve candles, relics, and maybe a dash of mercury. We, with the benefit of modern hindsight and slightly fewer leeches, know it was simpler. The curse of Charles II wasn't cast by witches. It was woven into his DNA. Centuries of cousin-to-cousin marriage had turned the royal bloodline into a genetic feedback loop. Imagine photocopying a photograph, then photocopying the photocopy, over and over, until the image starts to blur and tear at the edges. That was the Habsburg genome, once vivid, now barely holding together. By the time Charles was born, the damage was mathematical certainty. His inbreeding coefficient sat at an alarming 0.25, roughly the same as the child of siblings. In genetic terms, that's not a bloodline, that's a closed circuit. And so the miracle child arrived bearing the quiet inheritance of centuries. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that his upper and lower teeth never met. It gave him that unmistakable Habsburg profile, heroic on coins, tragic in person. Eating was a daily ordeal. Courtiers reported that he swallowed food whole because chewing was impossible. The same deformity enlarged his tongue, making speech slow and slurred. His tutors pretended to understand him. His secretaries became experts in royal charades. His skull was disproportionately large. The result, historians suspect, of hydrocephalus, fluid pressing on the brain. That constant pressure may have caused his headaches, seizures, and what his doctors politely described as periods of absent thought. The poor man was essentially living in a body that nature had abandoned mid-construction. Still, in the 1600s, no one used words like genetic or neurological. Those were terms from a distant future. Back then, a malformed jaw was not the result of DNA. It was the mark of the devil, or perhaps of divine testing. A swollen tongue meant possession. Weakness was interpreted as purity. Medicine had no microscope, only metaphors. It's almost darkly comedic to read the doctor's reports now. One suggests that the king's melancholy might be caused by a chill in the stomach vapors. Another prescribes the ashes of burnt toad mixed with wine to harden the humors. Yet another recommends that Charles be made to travel frequently, for movement may stir the spirits of vigor. No one, it seems, thought to stir logic. But we shouldn't be too smug about it. Every age has its blind spots. Theirs just involved a lot more bleeding. The court's obsession with finding spiritual explanations for physical problems was, in a way, their attempt to make sense of something too terrible to name. They didn't know what a gene was, but they understood the weight of guilt, and guilt demanded a story, preferably one involving a curse. The queen, Mariana, clung to that narrative with fervent devotion. To her, Charles wasn't ill, he was chosen. His suffering, she insisted, was proof of holiness. Every seizure was a divine mystery, every fever a test. The devil envies our king, she reportedly told a confessor, which is one way to interpret epilepsy. When the king's health faltered, exorcisms were ordered. Monks surrounded his bed, chanting Latin incantations over a boy who simply needed a gene pool with more variety. In those rituals, the palace must have felt like a theater of the absurd. Picture it. Doctors applying leeches to the royal temples, while priests sprinkled holy water on the same spots, each insisting their method would save Spain. The air reeked of incense and vinegar, and in the middle of it all lay Charles, confused, trembling, and patient as only a child born to duty could be. By adulthood, the effects of inbreeding were unmistakable. His facial bones grew heavier, while his body remained frail, a mismatched sculpture of royal ancestry and human fragility. His limbs were thin, his chest sunken. He suffered constant stomach pain, fainting spells, and according to several accounts, strange lapses of understanding. One doctor noted he could not tell the difference between the sign of the cross and the act of waving goodbye. There's also the matter of fertility, or rather, the lack of it. Charles married twice and produced no heirs. The court blamed witchcraft. The physicians whispered about deficient seed. Modern science, with its cold precision, would later diagnose testicular atrophy and hormonal imbalance. In the 17th century, however, this was not something one mentioned over supper. Instead, priests were summoned to bless the royal bedchamber before each attempt at conception. Spain, it seemed, was trying to pray its way past biology. His illnesses piled upon one another like unpaid debts. Rickets, chronic infections, migraines, digestive disorders. The list reads like a catalog of royal misfortune. The miracle wasn't that Charles was sick, it was that he was alive at all. Contemporary reports describe him as melancholy and amiable, which is historians speak for quiet and tragic. He was said to have moments of lucidity, even tenderness, an ability to sense the discomfort of others, perhaps because he lived inside it himself. And that, maybe, is the most haunting part. Beneath the myths and medical charts was a man, a human being born into a nightmare of ancestry and expectation. He knew he was different. He saw the pity in people's eyes. One ambassador wrote that Charles looks upon himself with horror, as though the mirror were his greatest enemy. For all his divine titles, Most Catholic Majesty, Defender of the Faith, he remained a prisoner of his own reflection. It's easy to mock the Habsburgs now, to see their lineage as a cautionary tale of aristocratic arrogance. But in their defense, they truly believed they were preserving perfection. What they didn't realize is that perfection, when hoarded, becomes poison. The same logic that made them powerful, the idea that divine blood should never mix, was the very thing that doomed them. Centuries later, geneticists would examine the family records and confirm what superstition had only guessed. The Habsburg line had indeed bred itself into extinction. Recessive traits had found their perfect playground. In a way, nature had simply balanced the scales. The empire that refused to share its bloodline eventually couldn't share its future. And yet, amid all the irony, there's something undeniably tragic about Charles II. He was both the victim and the symbol of an age that confused holiness with heredity. The doctors couldn't save him because they didn't understand him. The priests couldn't heal him because they sanctified his pain. And the world around him, an empire that had forgotten how to breathe, mistook his endurance for divine proof. In the end, the so-called curse of the bewitched king wasn't supernatural at all. It was science waiting to be discovered, tragedy waiting to be named, a miracle by title, a tragedy by biology. There are few sounds in history quieter than a dying empire pretending everything is fine. In the royal palace of Madrid, that silence was deafening. The air was thick with incense, the kind meant to disguise unpleasant smells, though in this case it was disguising something more existential. Courtiers glided through corridors like well-trained ghosts, their whispers echoing between walls hung with portraits of ancestors who still looked healthier than the living king. Charles II's court was not a government. It was a theater, and the lead actor didn't know his lines. The ministers, bishops, and hangers-on played their parts with religious precision. They bowed in perfect rhythm, spoke in hushed reverence, and signed decrees with the steady confidence of men who knew the king would never read them. Officially, Charles was ruler of one of the largest empires on earth, stretching from the Philippines to the Americas. In practice, he was more of a decorative centerpiece, a golden symbol of divine continuity placed at the center of a very expensive dinner table. The regency of his mother, Queen Mariana, had taught the court a valuable lesson. Power is safest when it hides behind piety. Even after Charles reached adulthood, that lesson stuck. Decisions weren't made in the throne room. They were made in side corridors, whispered between rosaries and folded fan gestures. The king's signature was added afterward, usually with assistance. His hand, trembling and uncertain, guided by a secretary who murmured, "Yes, Your Majesty, just there." There's a description from a Venetian ambassador that captures it perfectly. "The court of Spain," he wrote, "is a place where everyone acts as if the king were listening, even when he is asleep." And he wasn't exaggerating. Charles often sat through hours-long councils of state, his wide, tired eyes darting from one minister to another as they debated matters of war and diplomacy far beyond his understanding. When a decision was required, he'd nod or occasionally blink, and the issue would be declared settled. No one dared question the wisdom of his silence. It was, after all, the silence of a king. Every performance requires rehearsal, and this one was no different. Courtiers developed the art of phrasing questions so that the expected answer could be delivered by gesture alone. "Your Majesty approves of peace, does he not?" they'd say, with the word peace dragged out just enough to make a nod convenient. The documents were signed, the decisions made, and the illusion preserved. To visitors, the system seemed absurd, but to Spain, it was normal. The country had learned to treat dysfunction as divine mystery. If the king appeared distant, it wasn't because he was confused, it was because his thoughts were too profound for mere mortals to grasp. When he forgot names, people called it humility. When he wept during public ceremonies, they called it piety. The irony, of course, was that Charles wasn't entirely oblivious. Beneath his trembling hands and unsteady speech, there was an awareness, a dim, painful understanding that he was being handled. He saw the glances traded over his head, the soft corrections whispered too kindly. And like any lonely person trapped in a room full of actors, he tried to play along. Sometimes he'd surprise the court by making an unexpected comment, a flash of curiosity or emotion. Once, during a council meeting, he reportedly burst out laughing at an ambassador's elaborate wig, completely derailing an entire discussion on trade policy. The courtiers, horrified, joined in immediately, pretending they too found it hilarious. From that day on, wigs at court were slightly less ambitious. He had what some might call a childlike faith, though in truth it was more of a child's need for comfort. He clung to rituals with the desperation of a man trying to anchor himself in a reality he barely understood. He attended Mass daily, sometimes twice. He prayed aloud, fervently and often, for clarity. And when that clarity never came, he simply prayed harder. The priests, of course, adored this. To them, Charles was a model monarch, humble, devout, uncomplaining, a living reminder that suffering could be sanctified if you threw enough holy water at it. They encouraged his self-doubt, telling him that every misfortune was proof of his spiritual importance. Spain's problems, they whispered, were the devil's punishment for envying such a holy king. And Charles, poor soul, believed them. As for the ministers, they learned early that the best way to keep their positions was to treat Charles's confusion as policy. Each faction claimed to know what the king really wanted. If Charles blinked slowly, one minister interpreted it as approval for war. If he sighed, another took it as a plea for peace. Spain's foreign policy for a decade could probably be mapped by his respiratory patterns. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the empire continued its slow descent into bureaucratic delirium. Letters from colonial governors arrived months late, complaining of shortages, revolts, and corruption. By the time those letters reached Madrid, everyone involved was either dead or promoted. And still, the king's seal was stamped on each reply, as if divine wisdom were traveling back across the sea. The palace itself became a physical metaphor for the monarchy, beautiful, vast, and suffocatingly ceremonial. Every room was designed for deference. The courtiers bowed so often that some developed what one ambassador wryly called the royal stoop. Servants polished marble floors until they could see their own reflections and avoided eye contact with them, just in case humility wasn't shining enough. And through all of it, Charles drifted like a ghost in a gilded cage. When he walked through the halls, people froze, partly from respect, partly from uncertainty about whether they were supposed to speak. Conversations resumed only after he passed, each whisper punctuated by the sound of his soft, labored breathing. He was treated not as a man, but as a relic. Everything he touched was sacred by proximity. One courtier even kept a handkerchief the king had sneezed into, convinced it would bring him luck. It didn't. There's a kind of loneliness that only power can produce. A loneliness born not from isolation, but from performance. Charles lived surrounded by hundreds of people who bowed to him daily and spoke for him hourly, yet none of them ever really saw him. He existed as an institution first, a person second, and a human being never. Occasionally, small moments of rebellion flickered through the fog. He'd refuse to eat when pressured. He'd lock himself in the chapel for hours, emerging with tears on his face and a look of quiet defiance, as if faith were the only thing he could control. Once, when a minister gently corrected his speech during a public address, Charles reportedly stared at him for several long seconds and said, "Then you say it." It was the most honest act of leadership of his reign. Still, even defiance was absorbed into ceremony. The next morning, a pamphlet circulated claiming that the king's silence in council was an expression of divine contemplation. Spain's propaganda machine was nothing if not efficient. By the 1680s, the system had become self-sustaining. Ministers governed in his name, the clergy prayed in his honor, and the people dreamed on his behalf. The king no longer needed to act, speak, or think. His existence alone was proof that Spain still had a monarch, and that was enough to keep the illusion alive. And perhaps that's the saddest truth of all. He wasn't keeping the empire afloat. The empire was keeping him alive. A boy raised to be sacred, now grown into a man too holy to be human. A court that bowed to its own reflection. A government that mistook ritual for reason. The empire no longer needed its king to think, only to exist. History is rarely kind to royal brides, and few fates prove that more cruelly than Marie-Louise of Orléans, the girl who left behind the glittering chandeliers of Versailles for a marriage that felt more like a funeral. When she first arrived in Madrid in 1679, she was 17, bright, French, and heartbreakingly alive. Her cheeks carried the soft flush of youth. Her laughter, a melody that belonged to sunlit gardens and dancing fountains. The Spanish courtiers, in their dark velvet and stiff collars, greeted her like a miracle wrapped in silk. They bowed, murmured blessings, and promptly began to mourn her. They had seen too many foreign princesses fade in that palace. Versailles had sent a rose into a mausoleum. Marie-Louise was the niece of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, and nothing could have prepared her for Madrid's darkness, literal and otherwise. The Spanish court was devout, humorless, and smelled perpetually of candle wax and damp stone. The women wore black even at weddings. The men bowed more than they spoke. Even the air seemed heavy with incense and unspoken grief. In France, she had been raised on laughter and ballet. In Spain, she was forbidden to smile too much in public because it might appear unchaste. Her only real joy came in riding, galloping through the palace grounds, her horse kicking up clouds of dust that looked for a moment like freedom. When courtiers scolded her for the unseemly habit, she reportedly replied, "I cannot gallop in heaven, so I shall do it here while I can." Her new husband, Charles II, was 20 but looked much older, frail, pale, and often lost behind his own eyes. Their wedding day was described as solemn, which was diplomatic shorthand for morbid. When Marie-Louise first saw him, her reaction was recorded by an attendant who said, "The Queen turned pale, as if realizing that she had been married to sorrow itself. And yet against every expectation, she tried. There was kindness in her, an instinct to nurture. She treated Charles not as a husband to be feared, but as a wounded child to be understood. He adored her instantly. To him she was warmth personified, proof that not everything in his world was broken. He called her Mi Reina de Luz, my Queen of Light." Their bond was by all accounts strange but sincere. He would watch her eat, smile shyly when she entered the room, and follow her with the helpless devotion of a man who had never known affection that wasn't ceremonial. She, in turn, learned to speak softly so that he could follow her words, and made a habit of slipping him small sweets when the court doctors weren't looking. But love in Madrid was never private. The courtiers watched their every gesture, their every sigh, as if passion itself were a political liability. The Queen was expected to produce an heir, preferably yesterday, and when months turned into years without the cry of a newborn, the whispers began. The doctors were summoned, and the treatments began. There was no indignity too strange for royal medicine. Marie-Louise was given tonics of bull's blood, pigeon broth, and ground pearls. She was forced to wear amulets filled with powdered herbs to invigorate the womb. Charles, meanwhile, was instructed to bathe in mixtures of wine and rosemary, an expensive form of optimism. When that failed, priests performed blessings over their marriage bed. When that failed, rumors suggested witchcraft. Someone, they said, had cursed the royal seed. The court grew restless. The ministers panicked. The people began to doubt. Without an heir, Spain's future hung in the balance, and every barren year turned love into burden. Marie-Louise felt it keenly. In letters smuggled back to her family in France, she wrote of her loneliness, her fear, and her aching compassion for her husband. "He is not wicked," she once said, "only sad, always sad." Her isolation deepened. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting reported that she wept often, especially at night. The once vibrant girl from Versailles began to fade into the muted palette of the Spanish court. She dressed in dark colors, ate sparingly, and rode less. The courtiers whispered that her laughter had become inappropriate for a queen, and soon enough she stopped laughing entirely. Charles, for all his devotion, could offer little comfort. His own health was deteriorating. He suffered from tremors, bouts of delirium, and long stretches of exhaustion that left him barely able to stand. Sometimes he would collapse in front of her, and she would kneel beside him, calling his name until the priests arrived. Theirs was a love stitched together by pity and endurance, tragic, childlike, and doomed. When she fell ill in 1689, the palace was thrown into panic. The symptoms began suddenly: stomach pains, vomiting, fever. The doctors, in their infinite 17th century wisdom, diagnosed everything from vapors of the womb to melancholy of the spleen. The remedies were as gruesome as they were useless: bloodletting, purges, enemas, even a concoction of powdered coral and holy oil. Within days, her condition worsened. Some said she'd eaten too many figs. Others whispered poison. The truth was probably simpler: appendicitis, untreated and unstoppable. But in Madrid, truth was rarely allowed to compete with superstition. When she died at the age of 26, the city bells tolled for 3 days. The courtiers wept publicly, as was required, but in private, Some sighed in relief. The queen was gone, and with her, the painful reminder of the empire's infertility. Charles, however, was inconsolable. Witnesses said he locked himself in his chamber, refusing food, light, or company. He ordered her rooms left untouched. Her riding clothes hung neatly by the window, where the sunlight still fell. He spoke to her portraits as if she could still hear him. One servant claimed that he often wandered the palace at night, murmuring prayers to bring her back. In one of his few coherent moments after her death, Charles told his confessor, "God has taken from me the only thing that was mine." For once, even the priests had no comforting reply. Her body was entombed in the royal crypt beneath El Escorial, surrounded by centuries of kings and queens who had all believed their line would never end. And yet, with her passing, the Spanish crown's last chance at continuity dimmed like a candle burned too long. Marie-Louise had been the foreign light in a darkened court, the laughter in a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. And when she died, something in Charles broke that would never mend. He stopped smiling. He stopped praying. Even the ceremonies that had once defined his life now seemed hollow. The courtiers continued their rituals, the empire its decline, but without her, the king's heart had gone quiet. The French called her La Pauvre Reine, the poor queen. The Spanish called her La Santa, the saint. History remembers her as both, the princess who brought light to a dying world only to be swallowed by its shadows. Spain lost its queen, and Charles lost his last light. And if you're still here, listening in the dark with them, maybe you understand what it means to watch something beautiful fade. So go on, subscribe. It's the only kind of loyalty history still rewards. When Marie-Louise died, Spain mourned in black velvet and candlelight. The bells tolled, the priests wept, and within a few months, everyone began whispering the same thing. The king must marry again. It wasn't out of romance, of course. It never was. It was survival. Spain was crumbling, and the crown needed an heir, someone, anyone, to keep the dynasty breathing. The only problem was that the king's body, much like his kingdom, was no longer taking orders. Enter Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was everything the first queen hadn't been, sharp where Marie-Louise was soft, calculating where she was kind, and most importantly, Austrian. Her family had a reputation for fertility that could practically be weaponized. One of her sisters had given birth to 10 children. That alone made her a political asset. Madrid saw her not as a bride, but as a breeding experiment. When the proposal arrived, Maria Anna accepted with the brisk enthusiasm of someone who understood the assignment. She had no illusions about love. This was power wrapped in lace. She left Vienna with a train of priests, apothecaries, and advisors, each sworn to protect Austria's influence at the Spanish court. When she arrived in Madrid in 1690, the contrast was immediate. Gone was the weeping French princess. In her place stood a woman with eyes like polished steel and a smile that could sign treaties. The courtiers, still draped in mourning, quickly realized the palace air had shifted. The candlelight no longer flickered. It calculated. Maria Anna wasted no time establishing herself as the power behind the throne. Charles adored her at first. He adored anyone who paid him attention. But she treated affection like a negotiation. Her politeness was immaculate, her loyalty conditional. Within weeks, she had reorganized her attendants, dismissed the late queen's allies, and surrounded herself with Austrians. The message was clear. Spain might have a king, but Vienna had a queen. Behind the embroidered curtains of the palace, Europe's great shadow war began to unfold. The question was no longer whether Charles could rule. Everyone knew he couldn't. But who would rule after him? On one side stood France, led by the glittering Sun King Louis XV, who wanted to place his grandson on the Spanish throne. On the other stood Austria, desperate to keep the vast empire from falling into French hands. Maria Anna naturally played for Vienna. She spun her web with elegance. Ministers who once bowed to France found themselves mysteriously reassigned or accused of treachery. Ambassadors who praised Louis XIV too loudly discovered their letters intercepted. Even the palace confessors, men of the cloth, supposedly neutral, were carefully chosen for their political reliability. If Spain's court had once resembled a monastery, it was now a chessboard. And the king? He was the pawn everyone pretended was a knight. Charles, increasingly frail, faded into a twilight of superstition and sickness. He spent his days surrounded by relics and relic collectors, praying for strength and miracles in equal measure. Every few months another doctor arrived to test a new theory. Holy water, laxatives, mercury baths. It's a miracle he didn't glow in the dark. His mental state began to unravel. He grew paranoid, convinced he was bewitched. In truth, he wasn't entirely wrong. Everyone around him was working a spell, though most preferred bribes to broomsticks. His confessor claimed that witches had stolen his seed to prevent him from fathering an heir. Charles, terrified, ordered a formal investigation into his own curse. The Inquisition, always eager for a fresh project, obliged. It's one of history's darker jokes that the most powerful empire on earth once devoted its full legal machinery to proving that its king had been hexed. A group of monks was dispatched to find the witches. They interrogated servants, courtiers, even palace cats. Dozens of people were accused, and at least one exorcism was performed over Charles himself, complete with chanting, salt, and enough candle smoke to fumigate a cathedral. The devil, as usual, declined to appear. Maria Anna encouraged the hysteria, though discreetly. The more distracted the king became, the easier it was to steer policy. She hosted secret councils with Austrian diplomats, promising them that Spain would name an Austrian successor when the time came. The French faction fought back, leaking rumors that the queen herself was poisoning her husband to keep him weak. She responded with strategic fainting spells and well-timed tears. Nothing disarms suspicion like public fragility. And the king, caught in the middle, believed everyone and no one. At night, he prayed over his relics, a lock of St. John's hair, a splinter from the true cross, a bone so dubious it might have belonged to anyone's grandmother, and begged for deliverance. His servants reported hearing him whispering apologies to God for failing the world. He still signed decrees, though it's doubtful he ever read them. Sometimes, when his tremors worsened, his signature devolved into a single shaky cross. Meanwhile, the empire outside grew restless. Armies starved, governors stole, trade routes faltered. But in Madrid, the courtiers were too busy staging miracles and conspiracies to notice the collapse. Maria Anna continued to perform the role of dutiful wife with theatrical precision. She visited the king's bedside, prayed with him, smiled publicly, and schemed privately. When her political position was threatened, she played her trump card, pregnancy, or at least the idea of it. Rumors began to circulate that the queen was expecting. The court erupted in cautious celebration. Bells rang, prayers were offered, the people rejoiced. Spain, it seemed, might yet have an heir. except there was one small problem. She wasn't pregnant. She faked the symptoms for months. Morning sickness, fatigue, cravings for fruit flown in from Valencia. The deception held until a doctor, far too honest for his own good, declared there was no evidence of royal expansion. The pregnancy quietly disappeared from discussion, replaced by the usual mutterings of divine mystery. The child, one priest explained gravely, must have been assumed directly to heaven. It was theology's most creative miscarriage. Maria Anna survived the scandal, barely. Her enemies redoubled their efforts. The French faction, now emboldened, accused her of witchcraft, corruption, and treason. She responded with counter-accusations so elaborate they could have been operas. By now, the palace wasn't so much a court as a courtroom where everyone was both witness and defendant. The people, long since weary of the charade, stopped pretending to care who ruled. Bread was scarce, taxes high, and miracles suspiciously selective. The priests still told them to pray for their king's health, though most were starting to pray for their own. Charles, for his part, retreated further into faith. He fasted constantly, trying to purify himself of whatever curse he believed plagued him. His body grew thinner, his eyes more sunken. He was a man dissolving in slow motion, fading into the incense and shadows of his own court. By the late 1690s, Madrid had become less a capital and more a mausoleum with staff. Every whisper carried political weight, every confession strategic meaning. Ministers plotted in chapels, ambassadors bribed confessors. And somewhere, in the dim light of his bedchamber, the King of Spain muttered prayers that sounded suspiciously like surrender. The priests claimed the devil was at work. The truth was simpler. It wasn't Satan sharpening knives. It was everyone else. Behind every prayer at court, someone sharpened a knife. By the final decade of the 17th century, the Spanish court had turned into something between a hospital and a haunted house. The corridors smelled faintly of candle wax, wine, and whatever herbs the royal physicians were boiling that week. Charles II, now approaching 40, was alive, technically, but that seemed to be the only measurable success of his medical team. The doctors had long since abandoned science, not that they'd ever met it. They had entered the throw everything at the king and hope God likes something phase of their profession. His daily treatment plan read like the menu of an alchemist with no sense of restraint. On Monday, leeches. Tuesday, purgatives. Wednesday, mercury baths. By Thursday, they were just praying out loud. And still, every week, the same cheerful bulletins were issued to the public. His Majesty enjoys perfect health and takes daily exercise. What they didn't specify was that the exercise consisted of walking 20 feet between his chair and his bed, assisted by 2 servants and the Holy Spirit. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so grotesquely sad. The doctors, for their part, were terrified of honesty. To suggest that the king's condition was hopeless was to invite exile, or worse, demotion to treating bishops. So they invented progress where there was none. His Majesty's complexion has improved, one wrote, as Charles's skin turned translucent. His appetite returns, another announced, moments before the king vomited on the tablecloth. By then, medicine had begun its slow transformation in other parts of Europe. Across the Pyrenees, physicians were discovering circulation, anatomy, the idea that illness might come from something other than sin. But in Spain, the body was still a battlefield between God and the devil, and Charles's frail frame was their favorite arena. The clergy insisted his sickness was spiritual, not physical, a punishment, a curse, a cosmic test of endurance. The physicians nodded politely, prescribed holy water, and took notes on how to invoice the church. It was the only moment of cooperation between science and religion in the entire Habsburg century. And so the palace filled with relics, charms, and imported superstition. Splinters of the true cross hung above the king's bed. Bottles of Jordan River water lined the shelves. An amulet supposedly containing the breath of St. Francis was worn around his neck, an item which, you'll be pleased to know, was later proven to contain nothing but dust and wishful thinking. The line between doctor and priest blurred completely. They worked in shifts, the physicians by day, the exorcists by night. One would bleed the king while the other sprinkled salt on his wounds to keep the demons out. To them, pain was diagnostic evidence. If the treatment hurt, it was working. If the patient screamed, all the better, proof the devil was leaving. At one point, they ordered a full autopsy in advance, not on his corpse, mind you, but on his soul. A tribunal of theologians met to determine whether the king's suffering was a sign of sanctity or sin. After several weeks of debate, they concluded brilliantly that it was both. This was the era of the great royal exorcisms, ceremonies so elaborate that they could have sold tickets. The Inquisition, never one to miss an opportunity for spectacle, arranged them with the precision of theater directors. Charles would be carried into the chapel, pale as marble, surrounded by monks chanting psalms. Incense clouds filled the air so thickly that even the demons, if present, would have struggled to breathe. One account describes the king trembling violently as priests shouted Latin incantations over him. The scene lasted hours. When Charles finally fainted, they declared victory, proof that the evil spirit had fled. He woke up the next morning weaker than ever, which they took as a good sign. In 17th century Spain, worse was simply the prelude to better someday, probably. The treatments continued in cycles. The holy water turned to vinegar, the vinegar to wine, the wine to mercury, the mercury back to holy water. It was less a medical regimen than an alchemical bingo card. Nothing worked, of course, but each failure was reinterpreted as progress. The king's patience is saintly, one confessor reported. Truly, his suffering redeems us all. By this point, even the common people had started to notice the irony. Madrid's taverns buzzed with jokes that would have gotten anyone executed a century earlier. If the king's doctors don't kill him, one said, the priests will. It was the sort of gallows humor that only an empire in decline could afford. But beneath the absurdity lay something tragic. The courtiers genuinely believed they were helping. Every relic placed by the bed, every candle lit at midnight, every whispered prayer came from desperation, the last defense against a truth no one could speak aloud, that the royal body, like the empire itself, was beyond saving. Even Charles seemed to sense it. In his lucid moments, he begged to know why God punished him so. "What sin have I committed?" he once asked his confessor. The answer he received was painfully Spanish. "The sins of your ancestors, Majesty. You bear their cross." It's hard to imagine a crueler theology, one that blames a dying man for the genetic arrogance of generations. And yet, Charles accepted it. What else could he do? In a world where medicine was superstition's handmaiden, guilt was the only thing anyone could control. By now, his days were divided between fainting fits and rituals. Priests prayed over his meals. Monks performed purification ceremonies in his bedchamber. Candles burned day and night, their wax dripping into little rivers across the marble floors. At dusk, the physicians would enter again, armed with syringes of gold and potions of despair. It was a joint venture between heaven and hell, and neither was making profit. When foreign diplomats visited, the court made sure the king looked presentable. They painted color into his cheeks with rouge, placed him upright on his throne, and posed him beside relics for effect. His majesty grows stronger each day, the courtiers would say as his eyes fluttered in exhaustion. Public image had replaced pulse as the measure of health, and the empire, ever faithful, believed it, or pretended to. It was easier to imagine their king as bewitched than as broken. After all, curses can be lifted. Biology cannot. In the end, what passed for medicine in Madrid was little more than theater, a performance where everyone had a role, the king, the doctors, the priests, and even the demons. The problem was, no one could tell anymore who was acting and who was genuinely possessed. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh. The jars of relics, the endless exorcisms, the reports of improvement sent to a dying nation. It all reads like a tragic comedy staged in slow motion. But it wasn't stupidity that drove them. It was faith, stretched to madness. When reason fails, belief takes the stage, and belief never knows when to stop bowing. By the turn of the century, Charles's body was little more than a museum of pain. Bones brittle, skin gray, eyes sunken deep into a face that had forgotten how to smile. And still, the priests prayed, and the doctors prescribed, and the courtiers applauded every minor heartbeat as if it were divine will. Spain no longer knew where God ended and medicine began. Faith had become medicine's disguise. By the end of the 17th century, Spain had stopped pretending things were normal and moved on to something far more theatrical, mass spiritual hysteria. When all else failed, medicine, diplomacy, even denial, the empire turned to its oldest national pastime, blaming the devil. It began quietly enough. A few murmurs from the clergy, a few pamphlets printed in the back rooms of Madrid, whispering that the king's condition could not possibly be natural. After all, how could God's chosen monarch be this ill, this cursed, this, well, bewitched? Soon the rumor grew legs, and then wings. By 1698, the entire empire was convinced that Charles II of Spain wasn't just sick, he was under attack by Satan himself. To the faithful, this made perfect sense. Spain had once ruled half the known world. Now, it couldn't even rule its own treasury. The crops were failing, wars were draining the coffers, and the king's health looked like a national metaphor in human form. What better explanation than demonic interference? It was comforting in a way. The devil, at least, had a plan. The Inquisition, never a group to miss a good branding opportunity, decided to investigate. They formed an official committee to determine whether His Most Catholic Majesty was, in fact, possessed. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, this was a legitimate public service. They combed through confessions, interrogated servants, and even examined the royal laundry for signs of infernal residue. I promise, that's a real phrase from the records. Madrid buzzed with gossip. Everyone had a theory. The tailors swore the curse was stitched into the king's robes. The cooks blamed a poisoned fig. The court astrologers pointed to an unfortunate conjunction of Mars and Saturn and said, "Well, what did you expect?" Even the queen, Maria Anna, ever the strategist, claimed to believe it. After all, if the king's madness was caused by witchcraft, then she couldn't possibly be blamed for his failures. Soon, Omens filled the skies. Every shooting star became a demonic signal. Every thunderstorm, a warning. A cat sneezed near the palace and someone wrote it down as evidence. The court chroniclers who had once recorded wars and treaties now took notes on weather patterns and bird migrations, looking for divine clues in everything that moved. Then came the prophecies. Every self-proclaimed mystic and miracle worker in Spain emerged from hiding. Peasants reported visions of angels weeping over Madrid. Monks claimed the Virgin Mary had appeared to them, warning that the king's soul hung by a thread. One poor nun from Toledo declared that she had spoken directly to Saint Michael, who told her that Spain's king is bound by invisible chains. Naturally, the Inquisition thanked her and placed her under observation, just to be safe. The hysteria reached its peak when a famous exorcist named Fray Froilán Díaz was summoned to court. He was a Dominican monk with the charisma of a showman and the confidence of a man who'd never failed to find a demon because he'd never looked for anything else. The Inquisition, always eager for spectacle, granted him permission to perform a spiritual investigation of the king. Diaz began his work with the diligence of a bureaucrat and the flair of a playwright. He interviewed servants, interrogated confessors, and cross-examined the royal physicians. Finally, he concluded that yes, His Majesty was indeed bewitched. The culprits? A cabal of witches who had hexed the king using a bewitched cup of chocolate. You can imagine the confusion in the kitchen. Immediately, the palace launched what can only be described as the world's least productive witch hunt. Chocolatiers were questioned. Maids were tortured. A court alchemist was accused of hiding a demon in his spice cabinet. When the dust settled, no one had been proven guilty, but everyone was a little more terrified. And that was the point. Fear was unity's last refuge. For one glorious year, Spain found something it hadn't had in decades, a common enemy. Not France, not England, not poverty, the devil. Citizens who had spent years complaining about famine and taxes now lit candles for the king's soul. Processions filled the streets. Priests carried relics through the capital, chanting prayers loud enough to drown out reason. Even the skeptics joined in. Doubt in that climate was dangerous. To question the curse was to question God's justice, and no one wanted to be the next person accused of handing out cursed chocolate. At the heart of it all, Charles sat pale and trembling, watching the country around him spiral into sanctified panic. He believed it, of course. He had to. When everyone you trust tells you you're cursed, belief becomes survival. He spent his days praying, fasting, and ordering more relics, because in Spain, holiness was the only medicine that didn't come with side effects. He reportedly asked one priest if he was truly bewitched. The priest, caught between honesty and unemployment, replied, "Majesty, if you are not, then Spain is," which for once was accurate. The king's exorcisms resumed in earnest. Relics were waved. Salt was sprinkled. Psalms were shouted at volumes that surely annoyed any self-respecting demon. Onlookers swore they saw shadows move, or candles flicker without wind. Some claimed the king's body trembled as the spirits left him. Others whispered that the trembling never stopped because the spirits never did. Outside the palace, the people wept openly for their suffering monarch. They saw in him the image of Spain itself, weak, tormented, abandoned by fortune, yet too proud to die. Charles had become both scapegoat and saint, the nation's agony given flesh. Painfully, absurdly, that faith bound them together. The nobles, the clergy, the peasants, all united in the shared conviction that their misery was holy. The devil had chosen their king, which meant God had chosen them. It was perverse, poetic, and unmistakably human. But unity built on fear has a short shelf life. The same hysteria that brought Spain together soon began tearing it apart. The Austrian faction accused the French faction of conspiring with witches. The French accused the Austrians of fabricating miracles. Ministers blamed confessors. Confessors blamed midwives. And everyone blamed the devil, who by now must have been exhausted from all the attention. Meanwhile, famine still stalked the countryside. Silver still vanished into foreign banks. And in Madrid, the palace burned incense over its own rot. There's something almost admirable about that level of collective delusion. When the body of an empire fails, the soul gets creative. They couldn't rebuild their ships or feed their people, but by heaven, they could organize a procession that would make angels weep. At one particularly grand ceremony, thousands marched barefoot through the capital, carrying icons and relics. The air shimmered with candlelight and the sound of prayers. Even the king was carried to the window, too weak to stand but still managing to lift his trembling hand in blessing. The crowd cheered as if they'd witnessed resurrection itself. For one brief moment, Spain believed again, not in reason, but in redemption. But faith, once bent by fear, never bends back the same way. Every new omen demanded another ritual, every whisper another witch. The people had learned to mistake panic for piety, and by the time the hysteria began to fade, Spain had spent its last reserves of faith trying to exorcise itself. In the end, Charles's supposed bewitchment did what no enemy army could. It united the realm in shared delusion, and in doing so, sealed its doom. Because when faith turns to fear, it demands a body to burn. And if you've stayed to watch the fire, maybe part of you knows how easily belief becomes smoke. So go on, subscribe. It's the least you can do for the ghosts still choking on the ashes. Empires don't collapse all at once. They unravel thread by thread, decree by decree, until what was once divine order becomes a very expensive mess. By the final years of Charles II's reign, Spain wasn't so much an empire as a ghost with paperwork. The wars had drained its veins, the debts had eaten its bones, and hunger, that quiet revolutionary, had begun its slow, methodical work. Across the countryside, fields lay fallow. Peasants boiled weeds for supper. Nobles pawned heirlooms to pay servants who hadn't been paid in years. Madrid streets echoed with the prayers of the desperate and the laughter of the mad, two sounds indistinguishable in an empire that still believed misery was proof of holiness. The court, of course, pretended not to notice. Pretending was, by now, Spain's chief export. The palace continued its ceremonies, its processions, its announcements of victories that hadn't happened. His Majesty's strength increases daily, declared one bulletin as the king's body visibly shrank inside his robes. Charles, once pale, was now almost translucent. His body, ravaged by disease, seemed to be giving up inch by inch, as if even his cells had grown tired of duty. He rarely spoke. He ate little. His eyes, those sad, watery eyes that had watched an empire decay, had sunk so deep into his skull that they seemed to be searching for another world entirely. The courtiers whispered about visions. They said he saw ghosts. His dead wife, Marie-Louise, his long-dead ancestors, even the Virgin Mary herself, all urging him to choose wisely when his time came. Whether those visions were divine or the side effects of years of mercury tonics, no one dared say. But Charles believed them, and belief, as Spain had already learned, was stronger than reason. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the vultures had begun to circle, both literal and diplomatic. Europe's great powers were already dividing Spain's corpse before it was even cold. France wanted it. Austria wanted it. England and the Dutch Republic wanted to make sure neither got it. The War of Spanish Succession hadn't yet begun, but its opening act was already being written on parchment and sealed with deceit. At the center of it all lay one frail man in a golden bed. Charles had no children, no brothers, no hope. The dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years was about to end with a whisper. And the question that consumed Europe was simple: who would inherit the ruins? On one side stood the Austrians, led by Charles's own blood relatives, the Habsburgs of Vienna, who claimed the throne by birthright. On the other stood France, led by Louis XIV, the Sun King, who argued that his grandson, Philip of Anjou, should inherit instead. It was a battle not of swords, but of signatures, and poor Charles, bedridden and fading, was the pen everyone wanted to hold. The manipulation began gently. Letters from foreign ambassadors arrived daily, dripping with flattery and piety. Austrian envoys reminded him of his sacred duty to his family. French diplomats reminded him that God loved peace, and peace required France. The Pope sent blessings so neutral they could be read as endorsements by both sides. In the midst of all this, Maria Anna, his calculating queen, fought tooth and nail for Austria. Her chambers became a fortress of intrigue. Spies moved like shadows between the walls. Bribes changed hands faster than prayers. When she realized her husband's mind was slipping beyond her reach, she brought in confessors loyal to her cause. They whispered of divine will, of family duty, of the eternal glory of keeping Spain in Habsburg hands. But the French had a secret weapon of their own: diplomacy disguised as destiny. Louis XIV played the long game. He sent emissaries not to the Queen, but to Charles's conscience. They reminded him of his dead wife, Marie-Louise, the French princess who had loved him. They whispered that naming a French heir would be her final wish. It was a cruel, brilliant move. Guilt, after all, was the one language Charles spoke fluently. By 1699, the king's health had become an international spectator sport. Foreign ambassadors sent daily updates back to their courts like weather reports. "His Majesty has eaten a fig," one wrote, "but is unlikely to digest it." Another reported, "The king's pulse remains weak. France grows hopeful." Even dying had become diplomacy. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was unbearable. Every servant was suspected of espionage. Every priest had a political allegiance. The king's own confessor changed weekly, depending on which faction had managed to bribe the Inquisition most recently. The court was a nest of competing miracles and strategic prayers. Charles himself drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he wept often, convinced that his suffering was the final test of his faith. When asleep, he moaned the names of his ancestors as if apologizing to them. One night, after a violent coughing fit, he called for his confessor and whispered, "Tell me, can a king sin by being born?" The confessor, ever resourceful, replied, "Majesty, you can only sin by dying unrepentant." And so Charles repented. For everything, for the wars he hadn't started, the marriages that weren't his choice, the empire that had died around him. He confessed until his voice cracked. And even then, he kept confessing in whispers. By late 1700, it was clear that his days were numbered. The courtiers prepared for his death with the same ritual precision they'd given his life. Lists of hymns to be sung, relics to be placed, official mourners to be notified. What no one prepared for was the will. After months of scheming, counter-scheming, and whispered persuasion, Charles made his final decision. Against the wishes of his Austrian queen, against the expectations of his lineage, he named as his heir Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France. The French faction had won. He claimed the choice came to him in a vision. "I have seen the Virgin," he reportedly said, "and she told me to leave my kingdom in the hands of the grandson of the most Christian king." Even his last act of state came wrapped in mysticism. When the document was brought to him, Charles was too weak to hold a quill. A servant steadied his hand. The ink dripped onto the page like blood, and with one trembling signature, centuries of Habsburg rule came to an end. One witness described the moment. He looked at the paper for a long while, as though reading the ghost of his ancestors in the ink. Then he nodded and signed. The will was sealed. The courtiers wept, and the world shifted. France rejoiced. Austria fumed. England prepared for war. The empire that had once stretched across oceans was now reduced to a diplomatic scandal with a pulse count. Days later, Charles lay dying. His body was swollen, his lips cracked. The priests gathered, murmuring prayers that sounded more like goodbyes. The air in his chamber was thick with incense and quiet panic. Outside, the city waited in uneasy silence, as though Spain itself were holding its breath. At the final moment, he looked to the crucifix above his bed and whispered, "Now I begin to die." It was the most decisive thing he'd ever said. When he exhaled for the last time, it wasn't just a life ending, it was an era. The empire that had once circled the globe now belonged to history. The crown of Spain passed not by blood, but by exhaustion. And in the archives of Europe, in ink faded by centuries, that decision remains. One man's shaking signature closing the book on 400 years of glory, greed, and God. One trembling hand signed away 4 centuries. When the king finally died on November 1st, 1700, the city fell silent, not with mourning, but with exhaustion. Madrid had been waiting for this moment for years, and when it came, the air itself seemed to sigh in relief. Bells tolled through the night, echoing through narrow streets and empty palaces. For the first time in a century, Spain had no Habsburg on the throne. The courtiers did what courtiers always do. They staged grief with precision. Black draperies were hung, masses were ordered, and official proclamations called the king's passing a holy release. Behind closed doors, however, the physicians were summoned for one last task. It was time to perform the royal autopsy. You can imagine their hesitation. For decades, they had treated Charles II with every superstition and potion known to man, and none of it had worked. Now they were being asked to open the evidence. The corpse of Spain's last Habsburg wasn't just a body, it was an indictment. The room chosen for the examination was cold, stone-walled, and thick with incense. A crucifix stood at the head of the table, as if to supervise the proceedings. The doctors, priests, and courtiers gathered in uneasy silence. No one wanted to be the first to look too curious. When they began, the first incision was met with gasps. Centuries of rumor had built expectation. Some said they'd find a demon curled inside him. Others a saint's relic. Others still, nothing at all. What they found instead was worse, because it was real. His body was a ruin. His organs, blackened, shriveled, and misshapen, told a story far older than the man himself. The heart, one physician wrote, was no larger than a peppercorn. The lungs were filled with water. The intestines were rotted. The brain was, in the words of another witness, dried to the weight of a walnut. And in his stomach they found nothing. He had died too weak to eat. Even the physicians, hardened by years of royal misfortune, recoiled. One fainted outright. Another crossed himself 3 times before declaring, "This is not a human body." But it was. It was the most human thing imaginable, a body that had carried the sins, secrets, and superstitions of an entire empire. In that moment, Charles ceased to be a man and became a mirror. What they saw on the table wasn't just the wreckage of a life. It was the autopsy of Spain itself. The withered heart. That was the empire's faith, drained by centuries of fear and ceremony. The waterlogged lungs. The weight of a nation that had forgotten how to breathe. The rotted intestines. The corruption that had eaten it from the inside out. And that shrunken brain, small, dry, and overburdened, was the mind of a dynasty that had thought itself immortal. Each organ was a metaphor, dissected in real time. The Habsburgs had built their empire on divine certainty, on the belief that their bloodline was sacred, and there, on that table, lay the proof of what sacred blood really looked like after too many centuries of worship. The doctors, of course, wrote an official report. They were careful, too careful. The language was respectful, pious, sanitized. They noted his holy patience, his endurance of suffering, his body afflicted by divine mystery. No one dared write what they actually saw. To say the truth, that the Habsburgs had bred themselves into extinction, would have been heresy. And heresy, even in death, was dangerous business. So the report was buried, just like the king. Only fragments survived in letters and foreign accounts, each retelling a little more vivid than the last. By the time the story reached Paris, it was a Gothic legend. A king so cursed that his organs had turned to ash. A monarch whose body crumbled like the empire he ruled. And yet, legend or not, the symbolism was too sharp to ignore. The Habsburg dynasty had collapsed under the weight of its own holiness. It had worshipped its bloodline until that blood turned poisonous. What the physicians found in that room wasn't just biology. It was theology undone. Outside, Spain tried to move on. The streets filled with the sound of carts carrying the first French envoys. Philip of Anjou, now Philip V, would soon take the throne, young, healthy, and very much not a Habsburg. The courtiers began practicing new forms of flattery. The priests adjusted their prayers to include a bourbon or two, and the people hoped, foolishly, that a new dynasty would mean a new destiny. But history doesn't heal that easily. The decay inside Charles II's body wasn't unique to him. It had been spreading through Spain for generations, through its politics, its religion, its fear of change. What the autopsy revealed wasn't an ending. It was a diagnosis. Even the architecture seemed to understand. El Escorial, the royal mausoleum where Charles would be buried, loomed over the valley like a stone confession. Its halls were vast and silent, lined with tombs that whispered of eternity. When Charles's coffin was lowered into the crypt, the echo that followed wasn't grief, it was recognition. The Habsburgs had built their own grave long before the last of them lay in it, and yet, even in death, the rituals continued. Masses were said, candles burned, relics kissed. The priests assured the people that the king's suffering had redeemed them all. The doctors nodded, the ministers sighed, and the empire exhaled its last illusion of holiness. It's easy now to see it as irony, that the same nation that had conquered continents could not save itself from its own blood. But in a way, it feels inevitable. Every great power leaves behind a corpse of some kind, sometimes a city, sometimes a belief, sometimes, quite literally, a body. Charles's autopsy was all three. In that silent room, under candlelight, Spain dissected its own reflection. The empire that had once sent galleons across the oceans was now sifting through its own entrails, searching for reasons. Faith had become decay. Pride had become pathology. And when the last physician placed his instruments down, when the priests finished their murmured prayers and the courtiers wiped their eyes for the last time, the truth hung in the air like the scent of wax and death. The nightmare he hid was never just his. It was Spain's reflection. Every empire believes its story ends differently, that its decline will be graceful, its mistakes poetic, its ghosts merciful. Spain was no exception. It wrapped its ruin in ceremony and called it sanctity. And perhaps that's the most human thing about it. Because when you strip away the candles, the marble, and the royal bloodlines, what remains of the story of Charles II is something painfully familiar. It's the story of a system that chose illusion over truth, of people who meant well, prayed harder, and still made everything worse. When we talk about Charles, the bewitched king, we like to call him cursed. It's neater that way. A curse is supernatural, mysterious, tidy. It spares us the discomfort of looking too closely. But curses, more often than not, are just human cruelty written in divine handwriting. Charles wasn't cursed by witches. He was cursed by a lineage that confused purity with perfection, by courtiers who mistook obedience for loyalty, and by a faith so frightened of reason that it called every question blasphemy. He was born into a system that could not imagine mercy without hierarchy, or truth without ritual. And if that sounds old-fashioned, well, we should pause before congratulating ourselves. Because in quieter ways, we still live like that. We build institutions that protect appearances instead of people. We call it stability. We silence the broken because their suffering makes us uncomfortable. We dress cruelty in duty, bureaucracy in compassion, and arrogance in tradition. And when the cracks start to show, we light a few metaphorical candles and tell ourselves it's fine, just another test of faith. The Habsburgs called their denial holiness. We tend to call ours progress. The vocabulary changes, the blindness doesn't. Charles's world may seem impossibly distant. Monks chanting over a trembling king, doctors prescribing relics, priests diagnosing sin. But at its heart, it's the same story that repeats itself wherever power fears vulnerability. The moment we start protecting the system instead of the soul, we begin writing our own slow elegy. And perhaps that's why his story lingers, not because it's grotesque, but because it's familiar. Who among us hasn't at some point mistaken endurance for virtue, or watched something fall apart and called it destiny, just to avoid the shame of admitting it was our fault? Charles II's tragedy wasn't that he was different. It's that everyone around him refused to see his difference as human. They saw only symbols, a king, a relic, a warning, a curse. No one saw the man inside the myth, the frightened boy beneath the crown, gasping for air in a room filled with prayer and politics. And that blindness, that refusal to see, is a curse we still inherit. We inherit it every time a society mistakes suffering for sanctity, or when compassion becomes conditional. Every time we tell ourselves that systems matter more than souls, that tradition is justification enough, that mercy can wait its turn. The courtiers of Madrid were not monsters. Most of them believed they were doing God's work. That's what makes it tragic. They loved their king, but their love was filtered through fear. They prayed for him, but never listened to him. They kept him alive, but never allowed him to live. And how many Charleses have we created since? People crushed beneath the expectations of those who claim to love them? Entire nations choking on the incense of their own ideals? It's tempting to think history punishes arrogance, but more often, it just repeats it. The faces change, the altars modernize, the prayers turn into policies, but the rhythm remains, a world terrified of imperfection, mistaking control for care. Charles II's body may have been buried centuries ago, but his story keeps breathing in ours. We see it in governments that protect their reputations over their citizens, in institutions that preserve their own decay with the language of duty, in the quiet spaces where power fears truth and truth learns to whisper. It's strange, isn't it? The same species that builds cathedrals to eternity also builds cages for the living. The same hands that can create beauty can also sanctify cruelty. We are perhaps the only creatures capable of convincing ourselves that we hurt out of love. When we remember Charles, we shouldn't see a monster or a relic. We should see the reflection he offers, a fragile, tragic proof that denial, given enough time, becomes destiny. His story is not just Spain's, it's civilization's favorite parable. The child who became a king, the king who became a symbol, the symbol who became a lesson. And yet, even in all that sorrow, there's something gentle left, a faint flicker of grace that refuses to die. Because buried within all that ignorance and ritual and arrogance was still a beating heart, a heart that wanted, in its clumsy, holy way, to love and be loved. His tragedy wasn't that he was cursed. It's that no one chose to see him beyond the curse. And that, more than anything, is what history keeps trying to forgive itself for. Because if we can see him now, clearly, honestly, compassionately, then maybe we can start seeing ourselves that way too. So take a breath. Imagine the silence after the bells stopped ringing in Madrid, the incense fading, the candles burning low. A kingdom that had mistaken its own reflection for eternity. And somewhere, in the silence between breaths, history still tries to forgive itself. If you've made it this far, you've spent the night inside an empire's last breath. You've walked its dim corridors, smelled its incense, and listened to the soft creak of history exhaling one final time. You've watched kings born like prophecies and die like warnings. You've seen a court that prayed louder the more it doubted, and a nation that mistook suffering for proof of salvation. And somewhere between relics and rumors, you met Charles II, a man history called bewitched, though really he was just unbearably human. There's a strange peace in that, isn't there? The realization that even the grandest tragedies are made of ordinary heartbreaks, that behind every crown is a child who didn't ask for it. Behind every empire, a body that eventually gives out. Spain's story, Charles's story, is not one of villains and saints, but of people doing their best in the dark, terrified that if they stopped pretending for even a moment, everything would collapse. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe that's why you're still here, listening long after the candles should have gone out. If there's a moral hidden in the dust of El Escorial, it's this: compassion is worth more than perfection. We keep building monuments to power when mercy would have done the job better. History never punishes cruelty as much as it regrets it, and every age, ours included, finds its own polite way to turn pain into policy. But tonight, you get to step away from all that. You're not in a palace anymore. You're just here, in the quiet, where even empires learn to sleep. The ghosts have told their story. You've listened. And that somehow feels like redemption enough. So rest easy wherever you are. The world outside can wait. Subscribe, if only to keep the ghosts talking and to remind the past that someone's still listening. Good night from Madrid, 1700, where the king finally slept and the empire never woke again. And thank you, truly, for being here, for caring about the forgotten, and for helping me keep history alive, one restless story at a time. Because every listen, every subscription is a little act of rebellion against forgetting.